Now, Apple and Qualcomm are two big tech companies. And if you're using a smartphone, a tablet, or maybe a laptop, you're probably using tech from either Apple or Qualcomm, or maybe both. Now, in this video, I want to look at Apple and Qualcomm, touch briefly on the history, some of the financials, look at areas where they don't compete, but more importantly, areas where they do compete, to see how they compare to each other. So if you want to find out more, please let me explain. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, Apple make smartphones, iPhones, tablets, laptops, MacBooks, PCs, Macs. They make some VR equipment and so on. Lots of consumer stuff. Now, Qualcomm are more about the internals, chipsets, audio chipsets, processors for smartphones, audio codecs, Wi-Fi stuff, Bluetooth stuff, 5G modems and so on. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, Apple was founded in 1976 by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. There was a guy called Ronald Wayne who was around for 12 days at the beginning there. Now, fast forward to now, Apple reported a net income of $96 billion for the fiscal year of 2023. Just let that sink in for a moment. And as of July 2024, Apple has a market cap of 3.3, almost $3.4 trillion, which makes it the world's second most valuable company. That is changing every day. There's, Nvidia and there's some of the oil companies. They're kind of vying for these different positions, but Apple sometimes has been number one, but it's a huge company. I mean, it's absolutely huge. We're measured in trillions of dollars. Now, Qualcomm was founded in 1985, so it's also a fairly old company, just like Apple, founded by Irwin Jacobs, who with 7 other former employees of a company called Linkabit, which was another communications company. They started Qualcomm. Now, it had a net income, so that means profit basically, of $8 billion for the year of 2023. So it's also a huge company, $8 billion just, in profit. And as of July 2024, Qualcomm has a market cap of $227 billion, which makes it in the world's top 50 most valuable companies. So, of course, they are both big companies. They measure their net income, their profit in billions of dollars, their market cap in billions, trillions of dollars. So you can see here side by side. But, of course, Apple clearly is the bigger of the company, with its net income, sort of 10 times larger than that of Qualcomm, and of course its market cap much bigger, measured in trillions of dollars. However, two very big companies with big profits. Now, in some areas, Apple and Qualcomm don't compete with each other at all. In other areas, they are in fact partners, and in some places they are direct competitors. So they're kind of enemies or frenemies. Now, Qualcomm doesn't generally make consumer end products, so you don't normally go down to the store and buy a Qualcomm laptop or a Qualcomm smartphone. So it doesn't directly compete with Apple in that sense, although Qualcomm has made the occasional consumer end product. It's not a consumer electronics company in that sense. In some areas, Qualcomm and Apple are partners. For example, the iPhone 15 and other iPhones use Qualcomm's Snapdragon 5G modem. So iPhone have got Snapdragon components in them, so Apple buy those from Qualcomm, and so they are partners. However, Qualcomm and Apple also direct competitors in some areas. Apple makes processors for its iPhone range, and Qualcomm makes processors for many Android devices. More recently, Apple and Qualcomm also became direct competitors with the release of Qualcomm's ARM-based Snapdragon X processors for Windows laptops, and these compete with Apple's own ARM-based Apple Silicon for its MacBook laptops. So we've both got laptops that are Windows or Mac that are using ARM-based processors. Some of those processors come from Apple, some of those processors come from Qualcomm. So you can look at it like this. Here's kind of a Venn diagram. On the left, we've got Apple. They kind of have the iPhone, the Apple Watch, the Mac, the iPad, and so on. And then kind of Qualcomm have got things like their 5G modem. Snapdragon Digital Chassis is an automotive thing for self-driving cars. And all kind of, you've got Qualcomm makes some codecs and so on. So they're in different areas from each other. But in the middle here, there is this crossover where they both make processors for smartphones and processors for laptops. Let's look at performance. This is a key metric. It's not the only metric, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But let's look at performance. Here we see Apple's A17 Pro, Apple's A16, and the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3. And you can see the different performance figures here for Geekbench 6, single-threaded and multi-threaded scores. So you can see that the A17 has the highest single-threaded score. The A16 has the next highest, and then the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 lower than that. But when it comes to multi-threaded, mainly the biggest difference being that the Apple do this with kind of 6 cores, and they can afford to do that because their single-threaded performance is higher. But you can see that there is, that the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 certainly is better than the A16 Bionic, and it's nipping at the heels of the A17 Pro. So we can see here that depending on which way you look at things, in the smartphone market, Qualcomm is a direct competitor with Apple, Android versus iOS, of course. But more interesting now, we've got Qualcomm entering into the laptop market. So here we can see again a Geekbench 6, and we can see the M3, the M4, and then of course Apple has lots of variations with the M3 Pro, the M3 Max, even the M2 Ultra, and these do have lots of different cores. If you look at the normal M3, it's got just 8 cores in it, and that's a laptop processor. But then the M2 Ultra's got 24 cores in it. Or the M3 Max got 16 cores. So big differences here. And of course that's reflected here in the multi-threaded score, because the more CPU cores you got, the greater performance you're going to get. So we can see here again that the Snapdragon processors are kind of smack here in the middle of the competition. So 8 cores, 10 cores, 10 cores, 12 cores, this kind of area, or another 12 core one here for the M3 Pro. You can see they're kind of competing with each other. Sometimes one's better than the other, depending on the exact configuration. But of course, when it gets to many cores, as you can see over here, the M3 Max, the M2 Ultra are in a different league. So you can see again that Apple and Qualcomm are direct competitors. Now, what's interesting about this graph is we can present this slightly different, and that's to look at, for example, the clock frequency. Now, one area where Apple are certainly doing well at the moment is all of their processors have a higher clock frequency. So the Qualcomm ones are at 3.4 gigahertz. And in fact, going back as far as the M2, that was already at 3.5 gigahertz, 4 gigahertz, 4.4 gigahertz. And so what that means, of course, is as you ramp up the clock speed, then of course you are going to get greater performance. So it's interesting to note here that these lower numbers, or in fact this one here, the Snapdragon X Elite, actually beats the M2 Ultra single-threaded score at a lower clock speed. And this is where it key comes in. What would happen if you ran a Snapdragon Elite, X Elite at a higher clock speed? And that's one of the things that Apple has been able to do, and there are different reasons for that. One is the process node. Apple are using a more advanced process node. There is also the engineering. There's also the ability to design the chips. There's a thermal budget. There's a whole bunch of things that affect this, but it's interesting that it isn't just only about, oh, this CPU is better than this CPU. In fact, we can divide this graph up again and look here, the relative performance compared to clock speed. And what's interesting, you can see the Snapdragon X Elite is actually the same here as the M4, and it's better than the other processors, the M3 and the M2 Ultra, because if you ran them all at the same clock speed, you'd actually get better performance. So that's interesting, because that means that if Qualcomm are able to increase the clock speed with a better process node, better thermal budget, better cooling, other things like that, then also it means they can reach higher performance. Now, of course, changing the clock speed has an impact on power consumption as well. So, as I said, this isn't the only metric. It also has an impact on sustained performance. So, I said this isn't the only metric. However, it's an interesting way of looking at the performance of these different processors. So, as I said, there is more to it than that. Besides raw performance, there are other things to consider. For example, if you are a Windows user, you may not want to switch over to Mac, or if you're an Apple user, you may not want to switch over to Android, or vice versa in any of those things. So it isn't really just a case of saying, oh, I want to use the best. Sometimes you've got an investment in a particular ecosystem, you're familiar with a particular ecosystem, and you don't necessarily want to swap. As I mentioned, sustained performance, power efficiency, and of course cost. How much are you prepared to pay for your Mac or for your Windows machine or for your iOS device or for your Android device and so on. So all of these factors come into play when people choose a laptop or a smartphone and where to spend their money. Okay, so that's it. That's my quick look at Apple and Qualcomm. Tell me, are you an Apple fan? Are you a Qualcomm fan? Don't be horrible in the comments. Just tell me which one you prefer. Okay, my name's Gary Sims. This is Gary Explains. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do give it a thumbs up. If you like these kind of videos, why not stick around by subscribing to the channel? Okay, that's it. I'll see you in the next one.